Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about the history of Gondor. And Gondor, throughout its history, changed quite a bit and had several major events. Unlike the northern kingdom of Arnor, on which I've done another video which I'll link to in the description, there are a lot more phases, I guess, in the history of Gondor as a kingdom. So there's a little bit more going on. So let's go ahead and talk about that, and we'll see what we think about it at the end. Now, the earliest kings of Gondor spent a lot of time kind of just recuperating from the War of the Last Alliance, in which Sauron was defeated, and we get an intimation of that because one of the first things that Tolkien tells us in the Tale of Years for the Númenórean kings in Gondor is that it was the seventh king who actually rebuilt Minas Anor, which we later become to know as Minas Tirith. So it took 7 kings after, Isildur and Anarion before they rebuilt the Tower of Minas Tirith, which is the westernmost of the main fortresses there. So what we don't really pick up from this section of the appendices, which is told elsewhere, is when Sauron made war against the rest of Middle Earth, he actually pretty much swept over most everything until Elendil and Gil-galad in their the far northwest of Middle Earth could actually come and fight back. They had to gather their power there to really push Sauron back into Mordor. So most of Gondor was pretty much overrun in that initial war. So you've got the rebuilding of Minas Anor, and in the same note he tells us that this became where the kings of Gondor would spend their summers rather than Osgiliath, which originally Osgiliath was the capital city of Gondor. You had Osgiliath on the river, you have Minas Anor, or what we know as Minas Tirith, at the end of the mountain range known as the White Mountains, and then you had Minas Ithil, which later becomes known as Minas Morgul in the mountains of Mordor. So you've got, kind of the two towers east and west, and then you've got Osgiliath in the middle. Osgiliath was the capital, and so it became customary at this point for kings to spend the summer in Minas Anor. After that, we don't really get a whole lot of any interesting detail other than kind of some of the conquests of the kings for a while. You've got a mention that there are men out of the east who come and attack Gondor. These get defeated. Then you have the line of what are called the Ship Kings, and that kind of starts a period in Gondor's history where it's very much on the rise. They one of the earliest Ship Kings actually builds a huge navy and defeats the port city of Umbar and takes it for Gondor for a while. Now, side note about Umbar, Umbar had always been a Númenórean port, but it was always held by what were called the Black Númenóreans, which were the ones who sided with Sauron when he was taken to Númenor and corrupted the king. So the Númenóreans who were on the corrupt side, not with Elendil, Isildur, and Anarion, they were the ones who held Umbar, and it had always stayed with them until this point in Gondor's history where they finally took it. After they took it, the king who took it died in a storm that sank his ship, and the men of Harad, the Haradrim, tried to recapture Umbar, but they couldn't ever recapture it until finally one of the kings of Gondor came down and just finally crushed them, and even they acknowledged Gondor's supremacy for quite a while. So you've got this point where Gondor is really expanding, becoming a very powerful force, and it even tells us that the borders extend as far north as the southern part of Mirkwood, as far east as the Sea of Rhun, and as far south at least as Umbar. So, it's compared to what we think of as Gondor at the time the Lord of the Rings takes place, Gondor was a huge realm. So that's kind of the early stages of Gondor's history, and then at the end of the line of the Ship Kings, you start to see somewhat of a decay because some of those kings after that took a little bit of more lax view as to how to run their kingdom, started to be a little less proactive, but there's ups and downs. So let's move into the next phase, which is where really bad things start to happen to Gondor. So the next stage in Gondor's history finds what Tolkien calls the 3 great evils that occurred to the kingdom of Gondor. The first of those being the Kin-Strife, and that's basically just a civil war that occurs. And the background is this: the the one king that was really, really lazy about being king, he actually just appointed his own son as regent to do everything for him. And his regent realized that the men who were north in the vales of the Anduin River weren't always really loyal to their alliance to Gondor in fighting the men from the east. And these are the same men, by the way, who would later become the Rohirrim. But at this point, their language and culture is quite different. And so he learns that they're not always being true to their ostensible alliance. And so after, kind of mopping up the Easterners, he actually sends his son north to try to cultivate a little bit more of a really solid alliance, and specifically with the one who was kind of the most powerful of the different chieftains of these northern tribes, because at this point they weren't all unified yet. And it just so happens that his son, who's up there doing this diplomacy, actually falls in love with this one chieftain's daughter and marries her. Now, this is kind of the first time a Númenórean of the royal house had really married outside of Númenórean lineage. So it's kind of an unusual thing. He comes back. He has a son, of course, who is the first to be, of Númenórean and mixed non-Númenórean descent, although those men are also somewhat akin, it tells us in the notes. But as a result, some of the men in Gondor of the other noble houses are not really happy about this whole thing, and they're kind of worried that the Númenórean royal line is going to diminish by mingling with, other non-Númenórean people. So they actually lead a revolt against this particular king once he takes the throne, and they actually do kick him out, although he escapes, flees back to the north to his family there, and then eventually builds up another army. In the meantime, the king who had the usurper king who had taken his place turns out to be kind of a nasty character, and so a lot of Gondorians are kind of not so happy about the way this turned out. So when the other king returns to try to retake his throne, a lot of Gondorians are like, that's probably a good idea. Let's kick this other guy out. We'll take a mixed race king over a really nasty, cruel king any day. So they actually do a reverse of what they had just done, kick out the nasty king that had taken his place. Now, at this point, oddly enough, you also have the men who had tried to overthrow and briefly succeeded in overthrowing the rightful king. They flee back to Umbar, so again, Gondor loses the major port city of Umbar, and this is where you get the Corsairs. At this point, they never really retake Umbar permanently, and this is kind of always a thorn in Gondor's side from then on. But this is kind of the first major huge problem that occurs to Gondor, because you have this huge civil war that kills tons and tons of their best men. So that's the first major evil. Then we get another note that there's a second major evil which comes along, and that is the plague. And the plague happens kind of all over Middle-earth, but especially in the north and whatnot, where it's colder and that sort of thing. But it still does affect Gondor, and it does kill the king and his sons. This is not the same king, by the way. This is a couple generations down. But you get, this plague that wipes out a lot of people, and that takes out a lot of different people in Gondor. A lot of nobles, a lot of the greater people in Gondor die. And at this point, they start to notice, there's all these bad things happening, and they all seem to be directed kind of at the race of Númenor, either in Arnor or Gondor. And people start to suspect, maybe this is all being willed and intentional. So they're kind of getting that idea that Sauron isn't totally gone for good. They're figuring this out slowly but surely. During this period also, you eventually get the kings removing permanently from Osgiliath to Minas Anor, or what becomes later known, of course, as Minas Tirith, partially because Osgiliath is being partly deserted. There are just fewer people because of the Civil War and the plague and all this other stuff going on. So the realm is kind of starting to shrink. It's very much kind of in its decline period. Now, the third evil I'm going to have to cover in a separate segment because there's quite a bit of that. So let's talk about the attack of the Wainriders. I should mention as a brief preface to the attack of the Wainriders that during that same period of the plague and its immediate aftermath, you do have one king who dies, and with him the white tree, which was at that time in Osgiliath, withers. His successor then plants a seedling in Gondor. So the white tree that we see in Gondor is not even the original white tree that was taken from Numenor. Also during this immediate aftermath, Gondor did retake Umbar for a short period of time, but basically just long enough for the Wainriders to come in and ruin all the gains that they had made. The Wainriders are a group out of the east who are very, very numerous, and they ride in wagons or wains, hence the name Wainriders. And they are so numerous that they just overtake all the northern men in Rovanion, which is that same group that was intermingled with the Numenorean royal line, and they almost end up conquering the entirety of Gondor. They make alliances with the men of Harad in the south. They have a stronghold up in the north, and they retake Umbar. And Gondor's northern army, even though the men of Rovanion kind of revolt, the men of the northern army of Gondor suffer a pretty nasty defeat against the Wainriders. It's only because of the victory of the southern army that they survive. The king in all of this gets killed, but the captain of the southern army, he wins his victory, manages to get far enough north to find the Wainriders celebrating, thinking they have all but won, wipes their party out. Sounds actually kind of like American history a little bit. And that's a reference to the Hessians, celebrating Christmas in Washington, crossing the river and taking them out during their Christmas holiday. But he finally defeats the Wainriders by taking them while they think they've already won, and then he claims the throne. Now, he's not a direct descendant. He is an offshoot from a sideline, but he is of the royal line ultimately. Nevertheless, at this point, the kings of Arnor actually claim the rulership of Gondor because basically their claim is, we're all from the same line of Elendil, and we're the more direct line, so we should rule both. And Gondor basically says, nah, we're good. So anyway, that tension kind of gets set up a little bit there. It never results in war between the two kingdoms, obviously, but there's a little bit of they don't like each other for a little bit. Eventually, that kind of becomes reconciled, especially once they realize that the attacks on the north from Angmar and the attacks on the south from all these different sources all really have the same guiding force behind them, and they realize, we should probably band together or we're all going to die. So you get past the Wainriders, and at this point, Gondor is really, really weak, and they can't really do a whole lot in terms of being proactive. At this point, the watch on Mordor, which was being carried out from the Tower of Minas Ithil and the Black Gate, which the Black Gate was built by Numenorians, by the way. All these fortresses that we hear about in the Lord of the Rings, they're mostly built by Numenorians specifically to keep watch on Mordor, so that if they start trying to build up again, they can stop them. Around slightly earlier than this, you also had Mirkwood becoming a little more evil because of Sauron's presence in Dol Guldur. You had a lot of things going on. So at this point, Gondor is really, really in decline, very much kind of on its last legs, in the sense that if anything had come along to really do a lot of damage, it probably wouldn't have survived. But at this point, they had fought off enough of the major hardships to make it just long enough. So then we move into kind of the last part of the kings and the stewards. So let's talk about that. So the name of the king of Gondor, who had basically rejected Arnor's claim to the kingship, was Earnur, and his son Earnur ends up being the last king of Gondor. And what happens here, Earnur, in the period where all this is going on, basically says, I'm not accepting your claim to the kingship, but I do agree that, we're all kin, and I should, I'll send you help if I can. He can't really do that for a while, but at this point, the northern kingdom of Arnor is under very heavy assault from the kingdom of Angmar, and they're almost totally destroyed when finally Eärnur sends his son Eärnur north with a great fleet to the Grey Havens. And when they arrive, that's kind of the turning point where they can finally push back against the evil forces of Angmar, and they, with their help, they actually have a pretty crushing defeat. And then the Witch King actually shows up kind of at the last minute and tries to kill Eärnur. Now, he ends up having to flee because he's completely outnumbered, and then he kind of taunts Eärnur, and Eärnur goes after to chase him, and then Glorfindel says, wait, don't chase him, and this is where he gives kind of the famous prophecy that no man will, be able to cause the downfall of the Witch King. And that's where all that comes from, is this great battle. So the Witch King flees and disappears out of the north. Later on, when Eärnur becomes king of Gondor, and Eärnur is very much a warlike personality. He's not a subtle strategist, let's put it that way. He's very much into contests of arms. He's, jousting, that sort of thing. And I'm not saying they actually did jousting, but that's the kinds of things he would be interested in. So later on, the Witch King, who at this point the people of Mordor had already retaken, not retaken, but taken Minas Ithil and turned it into Minas Morgul. Mordor was kind of on the rise. The watch had ceased on it a long time ago. So he basically issues a challenge saying, you were a coward up in the north, which is not really true. His horse, ran away with him because his horse was afraid of the Witch King, because everything is. But he's taunting him, trying to get him to show up to a one-on-one duel. Eärnur is wisely advised by his steward, basically, to don't do that. Don't be an idiot. So he rejects it first. Then the Witch King comes back a second time and prods him again, and he just can't take it. His pride can't take it. So he rides off, and he's never seen again. I mean, the only assumption anybody can make is that the people of Mordor basically just set a trap for him, ambushed him, and took him. So he never got to have a duel. It'd be interesting to know what would have happened if that had actually occurred, because it actually does say in the notes that the Witch King actually feared him to some extent. So you have some indication there that maybe if they did do a one-on-one duel, he could have won, because he was a very, very brave, valiant guy. He wasn't afraid of the Witch King the way that most people were afraid of the Nazgul. So that's an interesting speculation. At any rate, that's the end of the line of the kings. Then we get into the stewards, and the stewards mostly try to just kind of husband the strength of Gondor. Most of them are a lot wiser than some of the kings like Eärnur, who are a little more, just kind of warlike. So you get several different stewards who are kind of just sitting there doing their own thing, just trying to make sure that nothing more bad happens. Eventually, during this period, you have Saruman, who, comes on the scene, and because of the waning strength of Gondor, one of the stewards basically offers, here, you can have Orthanc, because we don't have the manpower to hold it. Also, during the period of the stewards, you get the Rohirrim, who are not the Rohirrim at that point. They become known as that later, but they come south to the aid of Gondor during another one of its major battles. And as a result, Cirion, who was at the time the steward of Gondor, and Eorl, who was the king of what we know of as the Rohirrim now, basically make their permanent pact of, they'll be allied forever, essentially. And that's when the steward of Gondor gives Calanarthon, which we know as Rohan, to the Rohirrim. And so they're kind of, again, this continuing the entire shrinking of the realm of Gondor. Of course, I should also mention, too, I almost forgot, after Eärnur dies, the kings of Arnor again reasserted their claim to the kingship of Gondor, but basically the stewards are like, no. Which, at this point, they really don't have any basis for that, because they have no surviving members of the royal household. So, technically speaking, the kings of Arnor would have a legitimate claim to the kingship of Gondor as well, But at this point, the kings of Arnor they're also very dwindled. They don't have nearly as much power, and they can't really enforce their claim anyway. And so, what are they going to do about it? So you get basically kind of a long period of kind of just back and forth. They're fighting off further attacks and whatnot, but they never expand again. They never do anything like that. And then towards the end, you have Ecthelion, who is kind of the most Ecthelion the second, I should say, because there's two Ecthelions and two Denethors in the line of the stewards. Ecthelion the second, under the advice of Aragorn, who is going under the pseudonym Thorongil, finally kind of attacks Umbar again. And he doesn't take it, but he does destroy a large part of their fleet, which is kind of what saves Gondor in the end, because if they hadn't done that, the threat from the south would have been much greater during the actual War of the Ring. And so during that period, he actually does get a little proactive and do something. He's also trying to just build up the defense, because at this point, Ithilien has basically been deserted. Osgiliath has basically been deserted. Everybody recognizes that Mordor is kind of on the ascendancy, and they realize it's going to, things are going to happen soon. So Ecthelion is trying to prepare for that. Aragorn, of course, is not telling who he is, but there's some mention that maybe Denethor realizes who he is, and Denethor, of course, doesn't like him at all. He's not happy about the fact that his father Ecthelion is favoring him to a large degree. So he's happy when Aragorn leaves, and Denethor is also pretty smart in terms of readying Gondor's defenses, unlike what it appears to be in the movie, where he seems to be completely uninterested in doing anything for the defense of Gondor. He's actually not like that. But he is also arrogant, prideful, and stubborn, and not willing to give up, his rule for, Aragorn being the rightful king. So he's kind of continuing that, and he's got other issues that come up in the Lord of the Rings itself. But that's kind of the story of the stewards. There's not really a whole lot of major detail there, other than they just kind of go back and forth. There was actually an earlier Boromir before the Boromir we know, who was kind of compared to Earnur in the sense that he's very, very warlike, valiant, powerful, and it says that the Witch King is kind of afraid of him too. So I mean, you get that intimation that really valiant heroes among men, potentially capable of fighting off the Witch King. The Witch King is not some invincible super force that can't be faced. So it's just there's this prophecy by Glorfindel, which I've actually done a video on that whole situation regarding Merry and Eowyn and the Witch King and exactly how all that works out. I'll link to that in the description as well. So, but anyway, that's kind of the stewards. There's a little more detail in the steward history, but it's mostly, like I say, mostly just kind of trying to maintain what they have, not really expand for the most part. So I'll go ahead and wrap up here. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of the history of Gondor. Obviously, if you want to read the full detail, the Return of the King Appendices A has a long section on the line of Anarion in Gondor, as well as, of course, the line of Isildur in Arnor, and you can read all the detail, get all the fun history and all that stuff, but a lot of it just kind of comes down to this battle was fought, this person died, and I didn't want to get into all that here. But it's an interesting point here that you can kind of see both Arnor and Gondor, while initially having a fair amount of growth and prosperity, eventually both decline. As Gimli, in seeing the town of Minas Tirith, the inner parts of it and all the stonework and things like that, he remarks to Legolas that you can see there's a lot of good stuff here, but there's also some parts of it that aren't so good, and it's just like that's just how the race of men is. They start out well and then they go downhill, and you can very much see that downhill slide in these histories, and it's kind of interesting to see. It always ends up being some king who just kind of gets lazy or corrupt or something like that starts that downhill slide, and it seems like there's really never any coming back from it. And that kind of that's kind of reflective of probably Tolkien's worldview, being a a Catholic. In his worldview, he's very much seeing humanity as a fallen race that's not really capable of ever achieving perfection in this life, and therefore, sooner or later, no matter how well it starts out, it's going to decline, crumble, and corrupt, into something worse than it originally was. So you can start out well, but nothing good ever lasts. So he's definitely putting that aspect of his worldview into these histories. Now, of course, you do get at the end of the Return of the King, the return of the king, and a renewal, but probably from Tolkien's perspective, that renewal is only going to last so long before again it's going to decline. And of course, this being the fictional history of Europe, northwestern Europe and England, we don't have any Minas Tirith to look at now, obviously. So obviously it did decline at some point, just as a aside. But anyway, that's kind of the overall theme, I guess, of the history of Gondor and of Arnor. So that's kind of the interest level, and it's also just interesting to see how the kingdom changes and different interactions with other peoples occur. If you're interested in history quite apart from fiction, then it's kind of nice that Tolkien throws in all this historical data into his appendices. So anyway, I've had a couple of people request histories of Gondor and the Kin-Strife particularly, so I wanted to go ahead and touch on that. If you did enjoy the video, please give it a like. Please share it around. If you want to catch more about Tolkien and the worlds he created, please do subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. And until next time, I am the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.